Okay, so I'm going to take a different approach from the previous speaker. As you see, I don't know if you can see the PowerPoint on the screen. Can we put it over here? As you can see from my presentation, I'm going to focus. Oops, this is the feedback on the microphone. I'm going to focus on open source or free open source software and development. But development not as in software development, but as in economic development or human development. And I'll take the point of view of a government who needs to use some tools to deliver some services to people like us. So we have gaps in many countries, and I'm trying to find innovations to deliver those goods to people. So that's my approach. I'm trying to see how can governments and stakeholders together use such a tool if it's useful in development. So I'm going to talk about the following things. First is why UNDP is doing this. UNDP doesn't develop software. We are not in this business. So why are we involved in this? Then I'm going to talk about where we are today. We need to know where we stand today in terms of socioeconomic and political indicators. So we need to know what are the gaps in the world. Then I'm going to go into ICT for development, which is a field which has been going on for 25 years. And where are we today again? And then I go into open source and discuss what is the role of the government, if any, on open source, and is it useful for doing things in a different way? Okay. Sorry. Go back. Oops. Okay, so UNDP, we work on something called human development, which is not economic development. There's a book by a famous economist called Amartya Sen, who studied like this, and the idea is that we need to offer people options to improve their own lives. So the more options I have, the better off I am. If you look at the north, you have so many options. I have a son, he's a teenager, he's going to go to school. He can go to almost any school. He has a difficult issue deciding to which school he has to go. When I was younger, in my developing country, I can only go to one school. I couldn't choose for many reasons. That's human development, that I can choose where my own future is going to go. So our job in UNDP is to get you guys to have many choices, not one, many. And you decide what's best for you. Okay? And this is not economic development. Egypt, as an example. Egypt has grown economically for the last 10 years at 5% per year, GDP growth. However, poverty has also grown by 5%. So you have a paradox. The country is growing, but the gaps are getting bigger. What's going on? So there's no correlation between economic growth and social equity. Okay, let me move to our second point. Where are we today? We have all these crises. We have food crisis, we have economic crisis, we have climate change. We've seen the natural disasters in Haiti, in Chile, in Japan. And we also have increasing inequality between and within countries. Interesting. We also have, in this region, we have, also, of course, the so-called revolutions going on. And we also have something very interesting, which is the growth, very fast growth of ICTs all over the world, especially mobile technologies. Give an example of inequality. I'm comparing Ghana to South Korea. In 1960, they had the same GDP per capita. And today, there's a huge gap. What happened? And Ghana, they're doing pretty well. Ghana is not going down. They are both growing, but the gap is getting bigger. Another example, Turkey and South Korea. Same thing. Actually, Turkey was doing better. Sorry. I'm skipping things here. Oops. Sorry about that. Turkey was ahead of South Korea. And today, Turkey is doing fine, but the gap is getting bigger. This is in the region. I don't know if you can see this. I have a few things here. This is the Human Development Index, and we have poverty index over here, Gini coefficients. You know, it's not very good if you look at this ranking over here, the first one. In the region, the countries are not doing very well when it comes to human development. So there's a lot of work to be done. This is fascinating. ICT access. You will see here that we have internet users are very small compared to mobile phone users. Usually the ratio is 3 to 1. In most countries in the region and in the world, this is the situation. You have more people on technologies, on mobile phones, and on internet. In the US, the Gini coefficient measures inequality. How much of the income it goes to the upper echelons of society. You see it's going up. It's not getting better. The US is getting more unequal. Actually, the US is more unequal than Egypt, if you can believe that, in terms of this. So income is going to people in the upper part of society, and people at the bottom are getting less. Interesting statistic. Okay, so ICTs, can they make a difference in this? Can we use them to make a difference in this picture that I gave you before, or this data that we have in our brains? We have 4 waves of ICTs. I'm going to do this quickly. First, connectivity, 1991. Of course, when we started doing this, nobody was connected to the internet, of course. Then we have capacity building in the in developing countries. We moved to applications, e-government, e-commerce, the famous dot-com bubble in the US, and then, of course, the crash of the dot-com. And then we have what we call the new Web 2.0 applications. And this is where we are today. Today we have 5 billion people on mobile phones, right? And we have 2 billion people on internet. In Africa, many African countries, the ratio is actually 10 to 1. So I actually did this diagram thinking on what's the difference between these two. This is mostly private sector driven. This is mostly public sector driven. They talk to each other, yes. So you have this different Wi-Fi, 3G, 4G, the slower connections, but they're different. You pay for everything you know on a cell phone. On the internet, you pay a flat rate, right? I pay for every SMS I send. On the internet, I don't pay. I just pay a flat rate. I can send 1 message or 10,000 messages. That's one difference. Why is that? Let's think about that. Is that important for development? That people have to pay for some things and not for other things? Probably it is. But we'll discuss in a bit. Diffusion. This is the, you should look at this chart in this way. We have the old technologies before 1990s, and then we have the new technologies in the bottom. And you have this, here the income levels of countries. And you see that in this is where the poor countries are. Mobiles, you see the difference? Internet, mobiles. Actually, we have more diffusion of mobiles in poor countries than ever before. For the first time in history, we have technology that has diffused so fast in 10 years. Okay? It's a fact of life. And we should think about this in terms of open source. Who's driving this? Who's driving this change? This is fundamental for the work we do if we want to have some sort of policies on open source or any other ICT platform. I will skip this one. This is not relevant for now. So why is UNDP doing this? As I said before, why are we doing this? Of course, I used to be a programmer. I used to when I was younger. Not anymore. I forgot all of those things. But why with this? Why is UNDP involved with this? So the UN has usually these great summits every so often. There was one, a big one in Rio de Janeiro in 1992 called the Earth Summit. Okay? I was there. And this is actually a summit on environment. That summit agreed, among other things, to have something called Agenda 21, which was an agenda to implement environmental and sustainable development in many countries. The agenda had 40 chapters. Okay? And the last one was called Information for Decision Makers. 1982. So we thought in UNDP, information, okay, maybe we can use email. Instead of sending people documents, we're going to send you emails. So we're going to set up email nodes in 40 developing countries. This is before, no, 1982, before the web. Why was this possible? Why? Because nobody was thinking about this. Nobody was thinking about internet as a tool for development. In 1982, a company called Novell, which our friend here represents, actually had the market for networks. They have a protocol called IPX. And I went to a debate in 1993 in San Francisco between Novell and the internet guys. And Novell refused to make IPX open. Because, of course, the IP protocol is open. Okay? So they built their own networks on IPX, and today Novell is a different company. So they lost the game because they were playing a close game. Microsoft was not in the picture. So there was nobody working on this. So when I joined UNDP in 92 to develop this project, I had to find a solution which was cheap in a sense, but also which was practical. So when I was setting out these 40 email notes in these developing countries, including Angola, Haiti, Honduras, Pakistan, Jordan, and a few other countries, there was nothing there. People never heard about email. We're in the fax era. So it was difficult to do. But we had to find a solution where, given no IP connectivity, I could actually have a computer in our office in New York, routing traffic from, say, Pakistan through New York via telephone connections, okay, dial-up connections, then to the internet. And the best solution was something called Linux, which I discovered by accident. So it wasn't that UNDP had a conspiracy to do open source. It was the only thing I found which was practical to deploy. But I posed a challenge, okay? And the challenge was that people didn't know how to use these tools in developing countries. Of course it didn't. So we had to spend a lot of effort on capacity development, very important, on building communities at the local level, and on getting partners on the ground to implement this. This is very important, more than the software itself. The people behind this are important. Think about this. The so-called community of open source in the 1990s was a northern-based community. The way they developed applications back then was that I have a need and I solve the problem. But my problem was different because it wasn't my need. It was the need of developing countries. And those are very different from what the people in the north who were doing open source thought. So you actually have to hire them to say, could you please develop an application which you can use in Malawi or in Angola? And that was difficult to do. Today is different, okay? But that was the situation back then. And so we had to develop our own developers in those countries. That took 5 years to do just that basic principle, to get people to understand the system, which is not common back then. It wasn't Windows, okay? They never saw this before, and we spent a lot of resources trying to convince both governments and local people to do this. And that was a challenge. And it worked in many countries. Okay, so why do we do now open source, or free open source? So I'm an economist. You put my economist hat. And there's something called public goods. Goods in the sense not of good or bad, but you know, goods as in good, and you sell a good or you have a good. And there's a theory here. So what is a public good? You have two conditions. One is the first one over here, if it's exclusive, access. Is it open or not? The other one is it finite, which is consumption. So for example, this good. Water. Water is free, right? But I'm buying it. Why? What is this good? In theory, the bottle is a private good. Why? Because once I buy it, you cannot buy it. And I need to pay to buy it, right? So it both is exclusive. I have to pay a fee to get into it. And second, once I get it, you cannot get it. If I buy a pizza pie, the same thing. We only have 8 slices, so I take one, you lose. I have to pay. For example, what is proprietary software? Think Oracle or Microsoft. Well, they actually are club good, right? They need to be exclusive, so they have licenses, but it's not finite. I can consume Microsoft licenses or Oracle licenses, and you can still use them. Nobody's going to consume it. So it's a club good. Now, open source. Let's think about this. You have some code there, which is open to all of us, so it's not exclusive. And if I use it, you can still use it. So it falls in here. It's a public good. UNDP is in the business of providing public goods, like education and health. Public goods usually are provided by governments. That's the principle. So think, security. Who's doing this? Not a private company, usually. Justice, good governance. All those are public goods. Open source falls into that, in a sense, but it's different. How is it different? Okay? First of all, it's a public good which is created by, not government, but by people like you and I. So it's volunteers, people who want to contribute. It's a very, very, very important difference. And it's given away to all of us. It's a donation, so to speak, by people of knowledge to us. It's like scientific knowledge. When Einstein thought about relativity, he didn't charge for this. He didn't put a license. If he had done this, we wouldn't be here today. So knowledge and license on the other knowledge. It's the same principle in open source. You can contribute, you build this by your knowledge. And I can benefit if I've never seen this because I can leapfrog, if you wish. I don't have to learn the same thing as before. So I start from a different point of view. And that's why we do open source. But it's also more tricky. Because as software is a special commodity, special good. How? I cannot touch it. It's like justice. I cannot grab justice. I can have justice. We can provide justice. But it's intangible. You cannot touch it. But unlike justice, okay, I can use open source. Use it for what? So it's a means to an end. And that's a point I want to make very important. Open source is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. So we need to find, if you agree with this statement, we need to find what, an end to what. Okay? If I'm using software, is it for my pleasure? Can we use it for something more social? And that's where we as UNDP come as a development agency. Now, when you copy this particular kind of goods, it doesn't cost you anything. Again, for every bottle that they have to produce, they have a fixed unit cost. I don't know, maybe it's 1 cent. But it's going to cost me the same amount of time, labor, and machinery to produce 1 bottle. Software, no. I produce 1 copy, and then the cost of reproduction, 0. I just say copy. Okay? There's no cost. There's no labor. There's no inputs. That's the big difference. Okay? So it's intangible. And this leads to emergence of new models. As Jorge was mentioning, services is one. IPR regimes, now it's becoming a big thing. Licensing. Remember, when IBM was giving these mainframes in the 1970s, he actually got the software for free. There was no licensing. They sell you a mainframe computer, and the software was actually free. You got a tape, this big tape, all the software was there. No charge for the software. It was open source. I can use it. I was paying for the machine. Today we have a different model. Okay, so what should governments do about free open source software? And there's a discussion on this. And I don't want to get into a discussion, but the issue is, should we have a policy mandating open source? And there's different opinions on this. Some countries have passed laws demanding that public sector needs to use open source. That might be accurate. I don't know. I think you don't need to. Because again, going back to my idea of options of human development, I should not just impose one. If open source is so good, it can actually beat out any other competitor in the market. Not because I am forcing somebody to use one particular piece of software. That's one point of view. But I think more important than that is, if you check off, I think it's a procurement angle. In many developing countries, when you do this huge procurement for software, you prepare this thing called RFPs, request for proposals. And when people who write those proposals, they always put a brand name for the software. And they never allow for open source as an option. This is typical in many developing countries. So when I advertise, in my Ministry of Education, everybody's going to have PCs. We're going to have a database. We're going to have this website. They actually put brand names. I don't want to mention any companies, but they have brand names. So we've been trying to convince governments that that's not the right approach, because you're reducing options. You have to put a very specification which is generic, which is saying, we need the following characteristics of the software. You should be able to do the following things, but not brand names. And even push a bit or promote the use of open source technologies, if that's the case. They compete, and the best wins. And that's one way to do it. But that's only one part of the action. Is that the most important part? Probably not. Again, if we have these huge gaps, not in the kingdom, but in other countries, nearby, by the way, can I use this tool to make a difference? That's the question you have to answer. Because you need to think that software, open or not, is just a means. I don't want to have a policy in government on open source. I want to have a policy in government that promotes human development, and for that, we can use open source. It's probably better. The other argument for open source that you can think of as a government is to think bigger. Think, innovation in the world happens in the north. 90% of innovation is happening in the north. Okay? How can we innovate in the south today? This is one entry point. You have knowledge given to us for free in code. But think, I need to read the code. No one else can read code. So you need skills. So having this knowledge there, sitting in these huge repositories, is good for us. But we also need people who are trained to absorb that knowledge and then use it in my local context. And that's very important. So having a law on open source is not good enough, in my opinion. We need to think bigger. Innovation, R&D, education, skills. We need people who can actually be top-notch, and read this complex set of code lines, and then tell us, we can use this in poor areas to deliver some sort of service. We can use this for those purposes. And I think that's the key point I want to convey to you. If you're a government official, and if you have a challenge, like I heard in December when I was here in a different conference, of e-skills or ICT skills, this is one tool, not the only one, but it's one that can actually help you leapfrog and get to innovation. Because in the end, innovation is going to change your society. And it's going to open doors, it's going to create jobs. And it's going to put you up there in terms of patents. And also think, most of what is done in the north doesn't always apply to our countries because we have different market. One example, I live in the US and I happen to have a laptop, a desktop, of course a cell phone maybe too. Maybe I don't have an iPad, I don't want to have but I can have one. So I have all these gadgets. But if I happen to be in Africa, how many can I buy of those gadgets? Probably one. Which one? A cell phone. There's no market incentive to create one gadget, right, in the north for people who are poor. That's why you're seeing now countries like Brazil and India and China producing sort of products, goods for the poor. They see a huge market because most people are poor. You know, 4 billion people in the world actually happen to live in less than $2 a day. That's a lot of people. But they buy things. They buy things. So it's a market there. So it's a different way of seeing the market, of having these different sort of gadgets. I don't need 25 gadgets if I'm poor, or if I'm happen to be not so well off. I need probably one, a smartphone maybe. That's probably the future. So again, governments should think about these policies, and how to integrate everything. So open source is not another priority. It's not a sector. It should be cross-cutting. If we have policies on education, on innovation, on R&D, and all those things, how can software, open source software, help? And that's the question you have to solve locally. I think it can, and you need policies for that. But it's not an open source policy. It's a policy that touches on all those development priorities. And that's what we want to do here. Let me talk about a bit of Brazil. I'm not from Brazil, but I work with Brazilian on open source and different things. Now, Brazil, in 2000, Brazil discovered that they were paying $1 billion a year on licenses. Government. They were paying $1 billion a year on different licenses, on software, databases, desktops, whatever. So they decided, when Lula came to power, President Lula, to move to open source, to save this money. And they say, well, instead of paying this, we can actually use that $1 billion to attack poverty, or to train our people to be top-notch, to develop innovation in Brazil. This is what happened. So Brazil started an open source movement from the government to implement this. But they hit a snag. And this is something that we discovered in 1996, that the GPL, the license, the famous license, is only applicable in English. So you cannot translate it into Arabic. Because you will be told by the FSF that it's illegal if it's not in English. Okay? There's no translation of the GPL into any language. So when Brazil tried to implement GPL, they were told, no, it has to be in English. But Brazilian law says anything that happens to be official has to be in Portuguese, the official language. It cannot be in English. So they had to come up with a different idea. That idea was something called what they called public software, okay, which is different from open source. Not only because of the license, but also because the way it's being implemented. So what is this public software? Similar to open source, but there's actually an ecosystem of softwares. So first, they want to have a centralized point for government to reuse software. Many departments in government actually do their own development, either outsource or they buy off the shelf. There's no way to control this. And again, just duplicating. So they want to have a single space where any government, local or state government, can actually see what applications are being developed at this point on any platform, and then be able to share in different states. Brazil is a big country, you know, it's a huge country, 200 million people. This was the first thing. So, second thing, ecosystem, meaning what? Well, you get not only code, you're supposed to provide also support and service to whomever wants to use the code. So when you upload the code into this portal, this public software portal, you need to have a contact or a company who can support that particular application for your deployment. Think, any local government, in many countries are poor, they cannot do this on their own. So if I offer them open source software just like this, they're going to be in trouble because there's no support. Right? So that's missing. This is a very important point. Just because we have software sitting there, no, I cannot use it if I don't know anything about this. I need help, either an expert or a company or, I don't know, NGO or, I don't know, someone. That needs to be in the ecosystem. So that's what the public software is doing. We have an ecosystem. And finally, we're trying to now make this international. So UNDP is working with Brazilian government trying to make this international. So we now work in Latin America, in different countries, trying to have the same sort of arrangements that you can actually put software in repositories and then reuse it with all this ecosystem in place. Of course, there are issues, but it's a sort of a step forward in trying to get this more into sort of the making this usable by people who are not like many of us who are techies, who can read code. Because we are privileged if we can read code. But if we are not, and most people isn't, then why use open source? If I can get the same thing from other easier to use or, you know, proprietary software. From the point of view of the end user, it doesn't make any difference if it's open source or not open source. And keep that in mind. If I need to get a document from the government, I don't care if the platform is done on Apache or in Microsoft ISS server, I don't know how it's called, whatever. I just want to get that particular service. So for them, it's not a big difference. But if I'm paying taxes, right, as a citizen, and I see that we're using the same amount of money of my taxes to reinvent every time the same software, then I have an issue, right? We should be able to rationalize that. If my public investment, which is coming from taxes, is being done to repeat across sectors for the same applications, then we should be able to make it cross-cutting. Let me finish. I want to skip this one. And looking ahead. So first of all, the world is different today. There is now the emerging economies, as I mentioned before. You have the Brazils, you have the Indians, you have the Chinese, who actually are developing new solutions on ICTs for development, human development purposes. This is very important. The kingdom can also join this. You can also be a part of this. So don't look at the north. Look to your peers nearby, because they need your help. It's very important. Second, open source. Again, it's a means to an end. And we need to then think how that means to an end can help us to tackle our priorities. If we think that the kingdom needs to be doing innovation, it is a great entry point. But you need to have the skills to absorb that knowledge and then be a big player in this. And that takes time. India took 20 years to get where they are today. India, in 1971, they started sending people to the US to study PhDs in computer science. 1971. 30 years later, they have Bangalore. Okay? It's not short run. So you have to start today. And that's a great tool if you want to be, again, doing R&D and having your own innovation process in your country. Let me stop there, and if you have any questions, we can have it later. Thank you very much.